The worst mistake executives can make is firing the person who quietly built the systems keeping them alive. The Atlantic Ocean rolled softly against the rocky Maine shoreline, while pale morning fog drifted across the water beyond the porch of the small cedar cottage I rented every February. For the first time in nearly 8 years, I had finally allowed myself a real vacation.
No compliance meetings. No infrastructure audits.
No emergency vendor calls at midnight. Just silence, cold ocean air, and the sound of waves breaking against dark coastal stone beneath a gray winter sky. I sat wrapped in a cream wool sweater with a cup of black coffee warming my hands while seagulls drifted above the harbor several hundred yards away. The tiny town outside Bar Harbor barely moved this early in the morning. A few fishing boats rocked gently in the marina while snow from the previous night still covered the sidewalks and rooftops along the waterfront. It was peaceful in a way corporate life never allows. 27 years inside Halbrecht Systems had trained my body to wake before sunrise expecting problems waiting inside glowing inboxes and emergency conference calls. But this morning there was only quiet. At least for a little while. My phone started vibrating across the wooden porch table at exactly 8:12 a.m. I almost ignored it. Almost. The caller identification displayed Human Resources Headquarters. Strange. Nobody from Human Resources had contacted me directly in nearly 3 years. I stared at the screen while cold wind moved through the pine trees surrounding the cottage. Then I answered calmly. Evelyn Carrington speaking. The woman on the other end sounded polished in the careful artificial way corporate human resources executives always do when preparing to damage someone's life while pretending it is procedural. Good morning, Evelyn. This is Melissa Grant from Executive Human Resources Compliance. Compliance. Interesting choice of word. My coffee suddenly tasted colder. All right, I replied quietly while watching waves roll toward the rocky shoreline below the porch. Papers shuffled softly through the phone before she continued. I apologize for contacting you during personal leave. However, leadership has finalized an organizational restructuring initiative affecting several senior operational divisions. There it was. Corporate language. Cold. Sanitized. Cowardly. Snow drifted lightly beyond the coastline while I sat perfectly still in the wooden chair, listening to a woman half my age explain my career like she was reading weather updates. Your position has been eliminated effective immediately.
No emotion. No gratitude.
27 years reduced to a sentence spoken between paperwork and scheduling blocks. Somewhere far offshore, a foghorn echoed faintly across the Atlantic water beneath the gray Maine sky. I closed my eyes briefly, not because I was shocked, because I suddenly understood exactly who made this decision. Younger executives, branding consultants, restructuring committees obsessed with modernizing operational identity. I had watched them quietly removing older institutional leadership for over a year now. Experienced people replaced with polished executives carrying expensive degrees and absolutely no operational memory. Melissa continued speaking through the phone. Your severance documentation and transition instructions will be delivered electronically within the hour. Transition instructions. Funny phrase considering most of the company's infrastructure continuity systems still ran through operational protections I personally designed over 2 decades earlier. I see, I answered softly while gulls circled above the freezing shoreline. She paused awkwardly, probably expecting anger or tears or negotiation. Instead, I simply asked one question. Did legal review my infrastructure continuity clause before approving this termination? Silence. Complete silence. Papers stopped moving on the other end immediately. Even the ocean seemed quieter somehow. I am sorry, she finally asked carefully. I stood slowly from the porch chair while cold Atlantic wind moved through the trees surrounding the cottage. My continuity clause, I repeated calmly. The one tied to active vendor stabilization oversight during protected leave periods. More silence. Longer this time. Then finally very quietly. I do not believe that was discussed. Of course it was not. Because executives obsessed with removing older employees rarely bother reading the systems those employees built first. I looked out across the icy Atlantic while snow drifted softly over the quiet harbor below. Somewhere back in Chicago, inside a glass executive tower filled with younger leadership celebrating another successful restructuring move, people were about to discover that terminating me during active leave did not simply remove an employee. It triggered something far more expensive. And judging by the sudden panic entering Melissa Grant's breathing on the other end of the phone, somebody inside legal had just started reading the contract they should have reviewed before ruining my vacation. The Atlantic wind grew sharper that afternoon while gray clouds rolled slowly across the frozen Maine coastline beyond the porch of the cedar cottage. I sat quietly beside the small gas fireplace inside the living room with untouched tea cooling near my elbow, while snow drifted against the windows overlooking the harbor below. My phone had not stopped vibrating since the termination call ended 3 hours earlier. Human Resources. Legal Division. 2 unknown executives from corporate operations. None of them left voicemail messages. That alone told me everything I needed to know. Panic had already started inside Halbrecht Systems. Around 4 o'clock, another call finally came through from the company's internal legal department. This time I answered immediately. Evelyn Carrington speaking. The man on the other end sounded exhausted already, which was impressive considering leadership had only destroyed themselves before lunch. Mrs. Carrington, this is Daniel Reeves from Corporate Legal Oversight. Oversight. Interesting word choice. Usually executives only remember oversight exists after making expensive mistakes. I stood slowly and walked toward the cottage windows while icy Atlantic waves crashed softly against the rocky shoreline below the cliffside property. What can I do for legal? I asked calmly. Silence lingered briefly before he responded carefully. We are currently reviewing your operational continuity agreement, connected to vendor stabilization infrastructure. There it was. Finally, someone competent had started reading the contract. Snow drifted sideways outside beneath darkening winter skies while I listened quietly. And? I asked softly. Papers shuffled through the phone. More silence. Then a controlled exhale. Mrs. Carrington, according to the agreement signed during the Northbridge Systems consolidation 8 years ago, termination during active protected leave automatically suspends enterprise continuity certifications for all third-party stabilization vendors. Exactly. When Halbrecht Systems acquired 3 major infrastructure networks during a disastrous expansion period nearly a decade earlier, I personally built the emergency continuity framework preventing catastrophic vendor instability during executive turnover. The board signed every protection clause without reading most of them because nobody expected the system's architect herself would ever become the risk event. Daniel continued speaking carefully while keyboards clicked rapidly somewhere behind him inside corporate headquarters. We are trying to determine whether those provisions remain enforceable. I almost smiled hearing that. Corporations always ask whether contracts are enforceable only after violating them publicly. They are, I replied quietly while gulls drifted above the harbor outside the cottage windows. Vendor liability protections renew automatically every January, unless continuity oversight transfers through approved succession review. Another long silence followed. There was no succession review, he admitted softly. Of course there was not. Because younger executives leading this restructuring initiative were too focused on eliminating expensive legacy employees to understand what those employees actually controlled. Somewhere inside Halbrecht Systems headquarters in downtown Chicago, conference rooms were probably filling with frightened executives staring at legal binders they should have reviewed weeks ago. Then Daniel finally asked the question leadership was terrified to say aloud. What exactly happens now? Outside the cottage, snow covered the marina while fishing boats rocked gently against icy docks beneath fading evening light. Every protected vendor tied to infrastructure continuity receives automatic suspension notification within 24 hours, I answered calmly, which triggers temporary operational non-compliance penalties until continuity authority is restored. He went completely silent after that, because he understood immediately what Human Resources apparently did not. Halbrecht Systems relied on 37 active vendors connected to federal infrastructure maintenance contracts across 3 states. Every hour of suspended continuity certification carried financial exposure clauses. Large ones. Very large ones. Daniel lowered his voice slightly before speaking again. How much exposure are we discussing? I looked out across the Atlantic Ocean while pale snow drifted through the cold Maine evening beyond the glass. Approximately $2.5 million within the first 72 hours. Nothing moved on the other end of the phone for several seconds. No papers. No typing. Just silence. Pure corporate horror. Finally, he whispered quietly, almost to himself, "Human resources never informed us before terminating you." There it was again. The real problem beneath everything. Executives obsessed with restructuring always believe experience is expensive until they discover ignorance costs far more. I returned slowly toward the fireplace while evening darkness settled over the frozen harbor outside. "Mr. Reeves," I said softly before ending the call, "you should probably tell leadership their biggest mistake was not firing me." He hesitated carefully. "What was it?" I stared into the firelight flickering softly across the quiet cottage walls. "They did it while I was still protecting the company." By sunrise the next morning, Halbrecht Systems no longer felt like a corporation managing a routine restructuring initiative. It felt like an executive building slowly filling with smoke, while leadership searched desperately for the fire they started themselves. Inside the downtown Chicago headquarters overlooking Lake Michigan, emergency meetings began before 6:00 while senior operations teams flooded conference rooms carrying compliance binders, vendor contracts, and legal exposure reports beneath cold fluorescent lighting. Outside the towering glass windows, freezing rain drifted across the city skyline while commuters moved through icy streets below, unaware that one human resources decision was already costing the company hundreds of thousands of dollars per hour. In the executive boardroom on the 38th floor, younger leadership members sat rigidly around the polished black conference table, while legal counsel projected continuity suspension notices across multiple wall screens. Red compliance alerts filled the room like warning lights on a sinking ship. How many vendors suspended operations? Chief Financial Officer Martin Holloway asked sharply while loosening his tie beneath the harsh executive lighting. A compliance director swallowed carefully before answering. 11 confirmed suspensions so far. More notices are still processing. Across the table, Melissa Grant from Human Resources looked visibly pale for the first time since the restructuring initiative began. Funny how confidence disappears once consequences become measurable. "This cannot possibly be enforceable," she argued quietly while legal teams continued reviewing continuity clauses across glowing laptop screens. She was an employee, not an entire operational division. One senior attorney looked directly toward her without blinking. "Mrs. Carrington personally designed the vendor continuity framework after the Northbridge acquisition collapse." Silence settled instantly across the conference room, because suddenly everyone realized something uncomfortable. The systems keeping Halbrecht operational were never fully institutionalized. They were personalized around one woman leadership decided to humiliate during vacation leave, because younger executives viewed her as outdated overhead instead of operational infrastructure. Meanwhile, nearly 1,000 miles away, I sat quietly inside a small waterfront diner near Bar Harbor, while local fishermen discussed weather forecasts beside steaming coffee mugs and snow-covered windows. Overlooking the frozen harbor, the waitress refilled my coffee gently while morning light reflected across the icy Atlantic beyond the docks outside. My phone rested face down beside untouched blueberry pancakes. I already knew what the notifications said without reading them. Vendor penalties, emergency board requests, legal escalation. Corporate panic always becomes predictable once executives realize systems cannot be replaced through motivational leadership speeches and branding consultants. A local radio station played softly near the kitchen while snow drifted across the harbor outside beneath pale gray skies. For the first time in years, I felt strangely calm. Not because Halbrecht Systems was collapsing, because I finally stopped carrying the responsibility alone. Back inside Chicago headquarters, executives continued spiraling beneath mounting exposure reports and investor pressure. By noon, cumulative vendor penalties had already crossed $800,000 while infrastructure partners began delaying compliance certifications tied to federal maintenance obligations. Worse still, outside restructuring consultants hired by Human Resources had apparently never reviewed operational continuity architecture before recommending executive eliminations. Governance advisors were furious. Board members were furious. Legal teams were preparing liability protection language before lunch. Around 2 in the afternoon, the Halbrecht board finally initiated a formal executive review tied directly to my termination. Not because they suddenly respected me. Corporations rarely evolve emotionally that fast. They reacted because money disappeared faster than executive arrogance could explain it away. My phone vibrated again while gulls drifted above the icy harbor outside the diner windows. This time the caller identification displayed Board Governance Office. I answered quietly while snow moved softly through the main streets beyond the glass. Mrs. Carrington, an older male voice said carefully, the board would like to discuss restoring operational continuity immediately. I looked out toward the frozen Atlantic Ocean where fishing boats rocked gently against snow-covered docks beneath the pale winter sky. That is unfortunate timing, I replied calmly. I am still technically on vacation. The freezing rain over Chicago turned into heavy snow by Sunday evening, while Halbrecht systems continued sinking deeper into operational chaos beneath the glowing skyline overlooking Lake Michigan. Across the downtown headquarters, employees moved carefully through tense hallways while executive conference rooms remained occupied nearly non-stop for 48 consecutive hours. Internal communication channels flooded with compliance alerts, vendor suspension notices, and emergency governance updates nobody had expected when leadership approved the restructuring initiative earlier that week. Funny how quickly corporations rediscover institutional respect once millions of dollars begin disappearing every few hours. Upstairs on the executive floor, emergency board advisors gathered around glowing presentation screens displaying projected liability exposure climbing steadily toward the full $2.5 million threshold. Legal teams reviewed continuity agreements line by line beneath cold recessed lighting, while outside consultants quietly avoided eye contact entirely. Nobody wanted ownership of the disaster anymore. Melissa Grant sat silently near the end of the conference table clutching a legal pad against her chest, while senior attorneys dissected internal approval chains connected to my termination. Who authorized bypassing operational succession review? One board advisor finally demanded sharply. Silence settled across the room, because everyone already knew the answer. Younger executives trying to modernize the company moved too quickly and skipped the institutional safeguards older leadership built specifically to prevent catastrophic transitions. Martin Holloway rubbed his forehead slowly while snow drifted against the towering glass windows overlooking downtown Chicago. How dependent were we on Evelyn operationally? A senior infrastructure director looked stunned hearing the question aloud. Completely, he answered honestly. Mrs. Carrington designed the continuity architecture after Northbridge almost bankrupted the company in 2016. Another silence followed immediately. He continued carefully. Most vendor trust relationships still route through protocols she personally negotiated. There it was. The truth finally becoming unavoidable. Halbrecht Systems did not lose control because one employee left unexpectedly. They lost control because leadership never understood the woman they removed was the institutional memory holding half the infrastructure together. Meanwhile, back in coastal Maine, the Atlantic Ocean rolled quietly beneath pale winter moonlight while snow covered the harbor roads surrounding the small rental cottage overlooking the shoreline. I sat wrapped in a wool blanket beside the fireplace with an old hardcover novel resting unopened across my lap while wind moved softly through the pine trees outside. My phone buzzed again for the 12th time that evening. Another executive. Another emergency request. Another attempt to sound calm while the corporation unraveled beneath them. I ignored it. Not out of cruelty. Out of exhaustion. 27 years protecting executives from consequences teaches women something important. People only call you indispensable after they spend years treating you like overhead. Around 9:30, however, another incoming call finally caught my attention. Vendor Relations Director Samuel Price, one of the few remaining executives inside Halbrecht who still respected operational reality more than image strategy. I answered quietly. Good evening, Samuel. He sounded drained already. Evelyn. The board launched a full governance investigation an hour ago. Snow drifted against the cottage windows while firelight flickered softly across the room. That was faster than expected, I replied calmly. Samuel exhaled heavily through the phone. The investors discovered human resources terminated you during protected continuity oversight leave without consulting legal. There it was again. The core stupidity beneath everything. They did not simply fire the wrong person. They ignored process while removing the person who created the process. Samuel lowered his voice slightly before continuing. There is something else. I remained silent. Internal emails surfaced this afternoon. Outside, icy Atlantic wind pushed snow against the dark shoreline below the cottage. What kind of emails? I asked softly. Another pause. Then carefully. Messages discussing the decision to terminate you specifically while you were away from headquarters, because executives believed it would reduce resistance from operations staff. I closed my eyes briefly after hearing that. Not because I was shocked. Because corporations always reveal their ugliest instincts once younger leadership mistakes kindness for weakness. Samuel continued quietly. The board is furious, Evelyn. I stared into the fireplace while snow covered the Maine coastline outside.
No, iyan suarat sufli.
They are frightened. There is a difference. Monday morning arrived beneath steel gray skies over Chicago, while Halbrecht Systems entered the most humiliating week in company history. Snow covered the streets surrounding the downtown headquarters while black executive sedans lined the curb outside the towering glass building overlooking Lake Michigan. Inside, the atmosphere no longer resembled a successful corporation. It felt like a government investigation unfolding behind polished walls and expensive branding displays. Employees gathered quietly near elevators and break rooms whispering about governance reviews, executive suspensions, and the millions of dollars vanishing through continuity penalties tied directly to one woman leadership believed was replaceable. On the 38th floor, the executive boardroom remained locked under governance authority, while outside counsel reviewed internal communications connected to the restructuring initiative. Large presentation screens displayed archived email chains beneath cold recessed lighting while board members sat silently around the black conference table studying evidence that grew uglier by the hour. Melissa Grant looked physically exhausted now. Her polished human resources composure had collapsed completely beneath days of non-stop legal scrutiny. One governance attorney adjusted his glasses carefully before reading aloud from another recovered message. Schedule. Termination during Carrington leave period. Reduced internal operational disruption expected if executed remotely. Silence swallowed the room immediately. Another message appeared across the screen. Legacy employees create resistance to modernization initiatives. Martin Holloway leaned back slowly in his chair while snow drifted against the massive windows overlooking downtown Chicago. You intentionally terminated a 27-year infrastructure architect during protected leave to avoid departmental pushback? Melissa opened her mouth carefully before stopping herself entirely. Because there was no defensible explanation anymore. The restructuring initiative had stopped looking strategic days ago. Now it looked vindictive, careless, and institutionally reckless. Meanwhile, nearly 1,000 miles away, coastal Maine remained quiet beneath pale winter sunlight reflecting across the icy Atlantic shoreline. I walked slowly along the harbor road near Bar Harbor wearing dark gloves and a navy wool coat while fishing boats drifted gently against frozen docks beneath the cold morning sky. Seagulls circled above the marina while local shop owners shoveled snow from sidewalks lining the small waterfront streets. The contrast between Maine and corporate Chicago felt almost surreal now. One world moved slowly and honestly. The other collapsed under layers of polished dishonesty executives spent years calling professionalism. My phone vibrated again inside my coat pocket. This time the caller identification displayed Halbrecht Systems board chairman. I stopped near the edge of the harbor while waves rolled softly beneath thin sheets of shoreline ice below the seawall. Evelyn, the chairman began carefully after I answered. The board would like to formally apologize for how this situation was handled. Interesting. Corporations rarely apologize until liability exposure forces humility into the room. I appreciate that, I replied quietly while gulls drifted above the frozen marina. He hesitated briefly before continuing. The board is requesting your presence at headquarters tomorrow morning for emergency continuity discussions. Snow moved softly through the coastal air while I looked out across the gray Atlantic horizon stretching beyond the harbor. And the executives responsible? Another pause followed. Governance review is still ongoing. Of course it was. Boards never move quickly when protecting themselves remains possible. I continued walking slowly beside the waterfront while cold wind rolled in from the Atlantic Ocean. Mr. Holloway, I said calmly, the problem at Halbrecht was never operational continuity. Silence. Then quietly, what was it? I watched a fishing boat disappear slowly into the pale winter fog beyond the harbor mouth. Leadership forgot the difference between removing inefficiency and removing experience. The line stayed silent for several seconds before he finally responded softly. "Will you come back tomorrow?" I looked toward the frozen coastline beneath the gray Maine sky while snow drifted quietly around the harbor. "Yes," I answered calmly. "Someone should probably stabilize the company before your executives finish destroying what is left of it." Tuesday morning sunlight reflected sharply across the frozen surface of Lake Michigan, while downtown Chicago glowed beneath pale winter skies for the first time all week. Outside Halbrecht Systems headquarters, employees gathered quietly near the entrance plaza beneath the towering glass building, watching black executive vehicles arrive one after another through snow-lined streets. Inside the corporation, however, the atmosphere remained painfully tense despite the clear weather outside. Governance investigators still occupied multiple executive conference rooms, while legal teams continued auditing operational approvals tied to my termination. Nobody discussed restructuring anymore. Now the only conversations happening behind closed doors involved accountability, liability exposure, and institutional survival. My car stopped beneath the covered executive entrance shortly before 9 o'clock while cold wind swept snow across the Chicago sidewalks surrounding the building. The moment I stepped from the vehicle wearing my navy wool coat and dark leather gloves, several employees standing near the lobby entrance visibly straightened. Some nodded quietly. Others simply watched silently while I crossed the marble floor beneath towering holiday decorations still hanging weeks after New Year's. Funny how differently corporations treat women once financial collapse proves their value publicly. Upstairs on the executive floor, board advisors and governance attorneys filled the primary conference room overlooking Lake Michigan beneath cold recessed lighting. Multiple legal binders covered the black walnut table, while presentation screens displayed vendor suspension metrics and continuity recovery projections. The moment I entered the room, conversation stopped entirely. Not dramatic silence. Respectful silence. The kind institutions develop only after expensive humiliation. Martin Holloway stood slowly beside the windows overlooking the snowy Chicago skyline, while several board members exchanged cautious glances across the table. "Mrs. Carrington," he began carefully, "thank you for coming." I removed my gloves calmly before taking a seat near the center of the conference table. 27 years at Halbrecht Systems, and suddenly the executives who terminated me during vacation leave looked genuinely uncomfortable sitting across from me. Governance Council opened the meeting immediately. As of this morning, cumulative operational exposure tied to continuity suspension has exceeded $1.8 million. Nobody reacted visibly because everyone already knew the final number would likely reach the full projected threshold. One board advisor folded his hands carefully beneath the recessed lighting before speaking. "We would like your assistance stabilizing vendor relationships and restoring continuity authority." There it was. The corporation finally admitting what should have been obvious before human resources destroyed themselves publicly. I looked slowly around the conference room while snow drifted beyond the towering windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Most of the younger executives who pushed the restructuring initiative were absent now. Governance Review had quietly removed several of them from operational authority pending investigation. Melissa Grant was nowhere in sight. "Before we discuss stabilization," I said softly, "I would like clarification regarding executive accountability." Silence settled immediately. Martin Holloway nodded once. "Human Resources leadership has been suspended indefinitely pending final governance findings." Another board advisor continued carefully. "The restructuring consultants responsible for bypassing continuity review were terminated last night." Outside the conference room windows, pale sunlight reflected across the frozen lake, while helicopters moved slowly between downtown skyscrapers beneath the clear winter sky. I remained quiet for several seconds before finally speaking again. And what exactly did leadership learn from this? Nobody answered immediately because deep down they understood the real problem had never been contracts or penalties. It was arrogance. One older board member finally exhaled softly before responding. "We forgot institutions are built by people, not presentations." There it was. Finally. Actual honesty inside an executive conference room. Across the table, legal teams prepared recovery documentation, while vendor compliance officers waited remotely through secure video connections displayed across large wall monitors. Halbrecht Systems still had a chance to survive this disaster. Barely. But survival now depended entirely on whether leadership was willing to value experience before the next crisis arrived. I opened the continuity binder slowly beneath the cold executive lighting, while snow drifted quietly outside the towering windows overlooking Chicago. "All right," I said calmly. "Let us see how much damage your modernization project created." By Wednesday afternoon, the atmosphere inside Halbrecht Systems had shifted completely beneath the towering glass headquarters overlooking downtown Chicago. The panic from earlier in the week had settled into something quieter and far more dangerous for leadership. Awareness. Employees across every operational floor now understood exactly what happened. A respected senior executive was terminated during vacation leave by younger management obsessed with restructuring optics, and the corporation nearly lost millions of dollars because the people making decisions never understood the system she built. Once ordinary employees recognize executive incompetence publicly, corporate culture changes very quickly. Inside the Maine governance conference room, vendor recovery negotiations continued beneath soft recessed lighting, while compliance teams processed continuity reinstatements across multiple operational divisions. The financial bleeding had finally started slowing. Not because leadership solved the crisis alone. Because the same woman they dismissed as outdated overhead was now rebuilding the infrastructure stability they shattered. I sat quietly near the center of the conference table, reviewing vendor recovery timelines, while snow drifted beyond the massive windows overlooking Lake Michigan. Around me, executives moved carefully now, more respectfully. Even their voices sounded different, softer, measured. Funny how quickly arrogance disappears once consequences become expensive enough. Across the room, Martin Holloway closed another legal briefing folder before speaking carefully. Vendor continuity restoration should reduce projected exposure by tomorrow morning. One board advisor nodded slowly, while reviewing updated compliance metrics displayed across the wall screens. Investors are stabilizing as well. Of course they were. Investors rarely panic permanently once institutions prove they can still recognize competence before total collapse. A younger operations vice president seated near the far end of the conference table finally cleared his throat nervously. "Mrs. Carrington," he began cautiously, "many employees are asking whether you intend to remain with Halbrecht after stabilization concludes." The room became quiet immediately. Interesting question. Because deep down everyone already suspected the answer. I looked out toward the snowy Chicago skyline while sunlight reflected softly across the frozen lake beyond the windows. 27 years inside this corporation. 27 years protecting systems, vendors, employees, and executives who rarely understood how much operational trust quietly rested beneath their polished presentations.
No, Ian answered gently.
Nobody looked surprised, just disappointed. Martin folded his hands carefully before speaking again. "The board is prepared to offer revised authority, expanded compensation, whatever is necessary." I almost smiled hearing that because corporations always discover budget flexibility after incompetence becomes measurable. "This was never about compensation," I replied quietly. Silence settled softly across the room. "Then why leave?" the younger vice president asked. I turned slowly toward the conference table beneath the cold executive lighting, while snow continued drifting across Chicago outside. Because if a company only values institutional memory after destroying it publicly, then the culture still has not learned enough. Nobody spoke after that. Not because they disagreed. Because they understood I was right. Halbrecht Systems nearly collapsed under the weight of executive vanity disguised as modernization strategy. They treated experience like a branding inconvenience instead of operational infrastructure. Across multiple floors below us, employees continued rebuilding trust in leadership, while governance investigators finalized executive accountability findings tied to the restructuring disaster. Human resources leadership was finished. Multiple restructuring executives quietly submitted resignations before formal governance action concluded. Outside consultants vanished entirely from internal communication channels. The company would survive now, probably even recover financially within a year. But some damage never disappears completely once institutions reveal how easily they discard the people protecting them. Later that evening, I walked alone through the nearly empty executive hallway overlooking the glowing Chicago skyline beneath falling snow. Employees passing by offered quiet smiles and respectful nods before continuing toward elevators and parking garages below. Not because I was powerful, because they finally understood something leadership learned too late. Real professionalism is not performance. It is consistency when nobody important is paying attention. I stopped briefly beside the towering windows overlooking Lake Michigan where snow moved softly through the city lights beneath the dark winter sky. 1 week earlier, executives believed terminating me during vacation would make the company look more modern. Instead, it exposed how fragile their version of leadership really was. And somewhere beneath the glowing skyline stretching across downtown Chicago, younger executives were finally learning the most expensive lesson of their careers. Systems do not collapse because experienced people grow older. Systems collapse when arrogant people convince themselves experience no longer matters. Friday evening settled quietly across downtown Chicago, while soft winter light reflected against the towering glass headquarters of Halbrecht Systems, overlooking the frozen shoreline of Lake Michigan. Snow still covered the streets below, though the tension that consumed the corporation all week had finally begun fading into something calmer and far more honest. Employees moved through the building differently now. Slower. More respectful. The endless urgency executives once used to justify every restructuring decision suddenly felt smaller after the company nearly destroyed itself trying to remove the woman who built the systems keeping it stable. Upstairs on the executive floor, governance teams finalized recovery reports while legal advisors completed the last continuity restoration filings tied to vendor stabilization agreements. The financial damage would take months to fully repair, but the corporation survived. Barely. Not because leadership handled the crisis well, because the same woman they terminated during vacation leave chose professionalism over bitterness when the company no longer deserved either. I stood quietly near the conference room windows overlooking the snowy Chicago skyline, while evening traffic moved beneath glowing streetlights far below. The city looked peaceful again for the first time since the termination call shattered my vacation cottage silence in coastal Maine only days earlier. Funny how quickly life changes. One cold human resources phone call had exposed years of executive arrogance, hidden beneath polished presentations and expensive leadership language. Behind me, Martin Holloway entered the conference room carrying a thin folder beneath the soft executive lighting. He looked older now somehow, more careful. The board finalized the governance findings this afternoon, he said quietly while setting the folder down across the polished conference table. I nodded once without turning away from the windows. And silence lingered briefly before he answered. Multiple executive removals. Full restructuring suspension. Mandatory continuity oversight reforms. Outside the towering glass walls, snow drifted softly across downtown Chicago beneath pale winter skies. Good, I replied calmly. Martin folded his hands carefully beside the conference table before speaking again. The board also approved your retirement recognition package. Retirement. Strange word. It sounded softer than termination. Softer than liability exposure. Softer than the reality of what this week actually revealed about corporate loyalty. I finally turned toward him beneath the warm executive lighting, while employees moved quietly through hallways outside the conference room. You know what the saddest part of all this is? I asked gently. Martin remained silent. I would have protected this company forever if leadership had simply treated people with dignity. The room stayed quiet after that because deep down he understood I was right. Halbrecht Systems almost lost $2.5 million not because contracts failed or vendors betrayed them. The company nearly collapsed because insecure executives confused experience with obsolescence. They saw age instead of institutional memory, salary instead of infrastructure, human resources spreadsheets instead of human beings. Martin exhaled softly while snow continued drifting beyond the windows overlooking the frozen lake. I owe you an apology, Evelyn. I almost smiled hearing that because apologies always arrive after consequences become unavoidable. No, I answered quietly while slipping my gloves into my coat pocket. You owe the employees a better culture than the one that created this. Somewhere below us, elevators opened and closed while staff members prepared to leave for the weekend carrying coffee cups and winter coats beneath the glowing lobby lights. The company would continue now. New governance. New safeguards. New leadership priorities. But institutions never fully recover from discovering how carelessly they discarded the people protecting them all along. I picked up my coat calmly before walking toward the conference room doors where executives once gathered believing my vacation termination would modernize the company image. Instead, it exposed the fragility hiding beneath their leadership entirely. As I stepped into the executive hallway overlooking the Chicago skyline, several employees paused quietly. Some smiled warmly. Others simply nodded with the kind of respect corporations cannot manufacture through branding workshops or executive seminars. Respect built slowly through consistency lasts longer than authority built through titles. Outside Halbrecht Systems, cold winter air moved through downtown Chicago, while snow drifted beneath glowing streetlights across the frozen city streets below. I stopped briefly near the front entrance and looked back once toward the towering glass building behind me. Only a week earlier they believed firing me during vacation would make the company stronger. Tonight the same corporation stood alive because the woman they treated like outdated overhead refused to become careless enough to let it collapse. Then I turned toward the snowy Chicago sidewalk beneath the winter sky and continued walking quietly into the evening while somewhere high above the city, inside conference rooms filled with frightened executives and expensive furniture, people were finally learning the lesson they should have understood long before destroying someone's peace to protect their own ambition. The most dangerous person in any corporation is not the loudest executive in the room. It is the calm older woman who quietly built the systems everyone else depends on without ever noticing.